Hey everybody, Marcus here. In the last two videos, we covered Descartes and his new formulation of the human being, followed by Nietzsche's critique of Descartes. It is from this redefinition of the human being do we find philosophers who followed Descartes taking up the reins and building out a new system from this new foundation. We will now turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a political philosopher who lived between 1712 and 1778. It is in the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that the political implications of the new Cartesian subjectivity begin to become apparent. Indeed, the primary goal of Rousseau's political philosophy is to articulate a new politics that will account for this individual and its freedom. The two concepts which define Rousseau's political thought are the social contract and the general will. Taken together, these two concepts form the heart of Rousseau's political philosophy. The social contract is for Rousseau a historical or, pseudo-historical phenomenon. At first glance, the purpose of the social contract seems to be to create a strong community. Rousseau writes, "Now, as men cannot create any new forces, but only combine and direct those that exist, they have no other means of self-preservation than to form by aggregation a sum of forces which may overcome the resistance, to put them in action by a single motive power, and to make them work in concert." Here, the social contract sounds less like a principle of individual freedom and more like a principle of community harmony, an attempt to ensure social cooperation made necessary by the exigencies of human life in its pre-social form. Of course, whether the social contract ever really developed in the way that Rousseau describes is largely irrelevant to Rousseau. His point is simply to construct a persuasive model of human society. Some suggest that the social contract is an attempt to explain how someone who discusses politics in terms of the first person singular, namely I, might with equal success use the first person plural, namely we. The social contract can with little difficulty be read as a principle of social unity and harmony. However, if we consider the reasons that Rousseau gives us for the establishment of the contract, we emerge with a very different picture. The motivation for postulating the social contract is outlined in the second discourse, in which Rousseau describes the origin of human inequality. Rousseau writes, "In the moment one man began to stand in need of another's assistance, from the moment it appeared an advantage for one man to possess enough provision for two, equality vanished. Property was introduced, labor became necessary, and boundless forests became smiling fields, which had to be watered with human sweat, and in which slavery and misery were soon seen to sprout out and grow with the harvests." Here, we get a very different picture of Rousseau's view on society. Society is now described as that which destroys the equality and freedom of the state of nature, replacing it with slavery. Rousseau writes, "The new society thus became the most horrible state of war. Mankind thus debased and harassed, and no longer able to retrace its steps or renounce the fatal acquisitions it had made. Now, here society is not a unifying, but an alienating force which oppresses and destroys the individual." The social contract, as Rousseau sees it, is meant to remedy this situation by creating a just society to replace the corrupt, oppressive society that has developed as mankind has moved away from the state of nature. It is still quite possible, of course, to read the contract as a principle of social unity rather than one of individual freedom. Rousseau might simply be criticizing one kind of social structure, the unjust one of the second discourses, and trying to replace this with a just social institution. However, if we examine the actual formulation of the social contract principle, it quickly becomes clear that Rousseau intends for freedom to be a fundamental part of this principle. He seems to want to find a form of association which may defend and protect with the whole force of the community, the person and property of every associate, and by means of which each, coalescing with all, may nevertheless obey only himself and remain free as before. Now, Rousseau is seeking a just society, to be sure. He is searching for a valid we. But what makes that we valid for him in that it shows a proper respect for the I? Well, Rousseau's criterion for the just society is that it must maintain and preserve the freedom that humans enjoy in the state of nature before society. What man loses by the social contract is his natural liberty and an unlimited right to attain anything which tempts him and which he is able to attain. What he gains is civil liberty and property in all that he possesses. It is Rousseau's fervent hope and belief that this civil liberty will be sufficient to make up for the real and terrifying loss of natural liberty. The freedom of the social contract is provided and ensured by the general will. Rousseau writes, "The unwavering will of all the members of the state is the general will. It is through that they are citizens and free." Now, it seems odd at first that such an unwavering, almost dictatorial principle could at the same time be a principle of freedom. Nonetheless, this is the claim that Rousseau makes. He goes on to claim that the general will is infallible. He says, "The general will is always right and always tends to the public advantage." Now, the general will is not the only will that a citizen possesses. Rather, it is the will that can see beyond particular, private interests and put these aside for the good of the community. Again, one reading of this is that Rousseau means to promote the interests of the community without concern for the status of individuals in the community. After all, why else would he de-emphasize particular interests to such an extent, while insisting that the will of the community should be dominated? Yet the situation is more complex than this. The replacement of the unjust social order based on inequality with an institution of legitimate political authority is supposed to preserve an individual's freedom while ensuring the content and motivational viability of the moral system. Again, freedom seems to be a key part of Rousseau's political system. The form of the general will says that it is meant to preserve social harmony and promote the interests of the community, but its purpose is to preserve freedom. The general will represents for Rousseau an attempt to reconcile freedom with the social order. Rousseau was not an anarchist. He recognized the need for viable social and political institutions, yet he was unwilling to let this need compromise the freedom of the individual citizen in any way. His commitment to an enlightened ideal of individual freedom precluded this possibility. What, then, is the status of Rousseau's politics? What political position finally emerges from this tension between individual and community? It is argued that Rousseau's position may best be understood as totalitarian democracy. That is, as a philosophy in which liberty is realized, and he says, only in the pursuit and attainment of an absolute collective purpose. Now, on this interpretation, individual freedom only serves the interests of the community. Liberty is unimportant as an end of itself. However, another way of looking at it is that for Rousseau, genuine authority does not in any way limit freedom. Rousseau does seem to seek a just social collective, but only so that it may serve the needs of the individual citizen. Now, due to the various possible ways of interpreting Rousseau, it is no surprise that conflicting interest groups have sprung out leveraging Rousseau's philosophy as a basis for their particular agenda. It is possible to construct an interpretation of Rousseau that favors the general good over the good of the individual. It is also possible to formulate an interpretation that combines both. However, due to the period in which Rousseau was writing in, and the shifts that were occurring in thought during that time, one would not go astray in positing that Rousseau's philosophy had a focal interest in the individual. Now, I believe that the key to understanding Rousseau's politics is to understand the status of the individual subject in his writings. Now, one commentator writes, "The full development of amour propre resulted in a world indelibly stamped with a value placed on the subject. As it appears, it is precisely this value, which is a fundamentally enlightened value, that distinguishes Rousseau's political thought and that renders deeply problematic any interpretation of his politics that does not offer an account of his devotion to the sovereign, individual subject as an ideal. Like Descartes, Rousseau makes the self a foundation of all that is human in man. Rousseau accepts the enlightened self as his basic unit of political analysis, and his politics, with its insistence on the precedence of individual liberty, grows out of this acceptance. Rousseau thus develops the Cartesian autonomous subject into a political entity. It is with Rousseau's work that the politics of the Enlightenment come into its own. Though in our evaluation of Rousseau we have stepped further away from the theological origins of modernity, we can clearly identify the cascading effect that has taken place. With the nominalist revolution, we eventually found Descartes reinventing the human being. Rousseau, in turn, builds from this vantage point and attempts to create a new politics that centers on this new individual. Now, in the next video, we will take a look at the criticisms that Nietzsche puts forward in relation to Rousseau. Now, I have the script completed, but yet again, it is fairly long and stands to have its own video. So for now, thanks for listening. Go team.